Red and blue lights painted my driveway in chaotic patterns as I watched 17-year-old Brandon Miller getting handcuffed behind his back. The kid was practically screaming at the officers, his voice cracking with indignation as he shouted about his rights and how his mother would have their jobs. Meanwhile, I stood calmly beside my pristine yellow Lamborghini Huracan, explaining to the lead officer exactly what had transpired. Neighbors emerged from their houses like moths to a flame, gathering on sidewalks and peering through windows. Their whispered conversations creating a symphony of disbelief that Karen Miller, our tyrannical HOA president, had raised a son capable of such brazen criminal behavior. 3 months earlier, I had moved into Willowbrook Estates with nothing but excitement and my beloved Lamborghini. The exclusive neighborhood seemed perfect with its manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and promise of peaceful suburban living. My tech consulting business had finally reached the point where I could afford both the house and the car of my dreams, and I felt like I had truly made it. The first few weeks passed without incident as I settled into my new routine, admiring how my Lamborghini looked parked in the circular driveway of my corner lot home. Then Karen Miller introduced herself and everything changed. She appeared at my front door on a Tuesday morning wearing a cream-colored blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed authority. Karen was in her late 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcomed me to the neighborhood with all the warmth of a tax auditor. Her gaze kept drifting to my Lamborghini, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She made several comments about the car being quite flashy for such a quiet community, suggesting that perhaps I might consider parking it in the garage to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Karen's initial subtle disapproval quickly escalated into a full-scale campaign against my vehicle. Within 2 weeks, I received my first formal warning, citing a vague clause about vehicles that might disturb the community's peaceful atmosphere. The letter was professionally typed on official HOA letterhead and signed with Karen's elaborate signature. When I researched the actual HOA bylaws, I discovered the clause she referenced was so broadly worded it could theoretically apply to any vehicle that wasn't beige or grey. I decided to ignore the warning, figuring she would eventually find something else to obsess over. I was wrong. Karen doubled down on her crusade, sending increasingly aggressive letters about noise complaints, alleged speeding violations, and concerns about the car attracting unwanted attention to our quiet streets. Each letter came with escalating fines, starting at $50 and climbing toward $200. What really caught my attention, though, was her son Brandon, who had started appearing whenever his mother and I had our driveway confrontations. The kid would lurk nearby, listening intently as Karen berated me about community standards and property values. Brandon was tall for his age, with an air of entitlement that made my skin crawl. The situation reached a boiling point on a humid Thursday afternoon in late August. I was washing my Lamborghini in the driveway when Brandon approached me alone for the first time. He strutted up with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. His chest puffed out and his chin raised defiantly. Without any preamble, he demanded that I hand over the keys to my car, claiming that since his mother owned the HOA, she technically owned everything in the community, including my vehicle. The sheer audacity of his statement left me speechless. For a moment, when I finally found my voice, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his demand. I explained to Brandon that HOA presidency didn't grant ownership rights over residents' personal property and that his understanding of both property law and his mother's authority was fundamentally flawed. The kid's face turned bright red as my laughter continued, and he began shouting about how I would regret disrespecting his family. He stormed off toward his house, but not before turning back to scream that I had no idea what his mother was capable of when someone crossed her. That night, around 2:30 in the morning, I was awakened by strange noises coming from my driveway. Living alone had made me hyper-aware of unusual sounds, so I immediately grabbed my phone to check the security camera feeds I had installed after Karen's harassment began. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. Brandon was crouched beside my Lamborghini with what appeared to be a crowbar and a screwdriver, clearly attempting to break into the vehicle. His movements were clumsy but determined, and I could see scratches already forming on the door handle where he had been prying. My hands shook as I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about the break-in in progress. The operator assured me that units were being dispatched immediately and advised me to stay inside and continue monitoring the situation remotely. Through my camera feed, I watched Brandon grow increasingly frustrated as my car security system proved more sophisticated than he had anticipated. He kept looking toward his house as if expecting backup, but Karen's windows remained dark. The kid had clearly decided to take matters into his own hands without consulting his mother. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Brandon must have heard them too, because he suddenly stood up and began looking around frantically. Instead of running, though, he doubled down on his efforts, attacking my car door with renewed desperation. When the first patrol car rounded the corner with its spotlight blazing, Brandon was still standing beside my Lamborghini with tools in his hands. Caught red-handed in the act of attempted grand theft auto, the officer's voice boomed across the neighborhood as he ordered Brandon to drop his tools and step away from the vehicle. What happened next was almost comical in its predictability. As the officers approached with their hands on their weapons, Brandon began shouting about who his mother was and how she ran the entire neighborhood. He insisted that he was simply retrieving his family's property and that the officers would face serious consequences for interfering with HOA business. The lead officer, a veteran with graying temples who had clearly dealt with entitled teenagers before, remained completely unimpressed by Brandon's threats and connections. Within minutes, the kid was in handcuffs while I provided the security footage as evidence. Karen appeared in her robe and slippers just as her son was being loaded into the back of a patrol car. She began shrieking at the officers about false arrest and police harassment, demanding they release her son immediately. When she realized the magnitude of evidence against Brandon, she shifted tactics and began blaming me for somehow entrapping her innocent child. According to Karen's twisted logic, I had deliberately parked an expensive car in my own driveway specifically to tempt her son into criminal behavior. The officers listened to her rant with professional patience before explaining that attempted grand theft auto was a felony regardless of the circumstances. The charges against Brandon were filed within 48 hours. Attempted grand theft auto, criminal mischief, and destruction of property. The scratches on my Lamborghini would cost over $3,000 to repair, pushing the property damage into felony territory. Karen hired an expensive attorney and began making threats about counter-suits and defamation, but the security footage was unambiguous. Her son had been caught on camera attempting to steal my car with burglary tools, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change those facts. The real consequences began piling up quickly. Other neighbors started coming forward with their own stories about Karen's abuse of power and her son's increasingly aggressive behavior around the community. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the situation, and Karen found herself facing a vote of no confidence from the very people she had terrorized for years. Local news picked up the story about the HOA president whose son tried to steal a resident's Lamborghini, and Karen's professional reputation began crumbling. As her employer distanced themselves from the scandal, Brandon was sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention and ordered to pay full restitution for the damage to my vehicle. When the judge read the sentence, Karen let out a wail that echoed through the courtroom, her face crumpling as she realized her son would be spending the next year and a half behind bars for his entitled stupidity. The HOA board had already voted her out by a margin of 8-1, with only Karen herself casting the dissenting vote in a pathetic attempt to save her position. Her neighbors, once cowering under her tyrannical rule, now spoke openly about her abuse of power and the toxic environment she had created in Willowbrook Estates. The local newspaper ran a follow-up article titled, "Former HOA President Faces Civil Lawsuit After Son's Arrest," detailing how 3 families were pursuing legal action against Karen for harassment and abuse of her position. Her employer, a prestigious law firm downtown, had quietly asked for her resignation after clients began questioning whether they wanted to be represented by someone whose family made headlines for attempted car theft. Karen's carefully constructed image of suburban authority had crumbled completely, leaving behind nothing but legal bills and public humiliation. As the bailiff led Brandon away in shackles, Karen turned to glare at me one final time, her eyes filled with a kind of hatred that comes from someone who has never been held accountable for their actions. But her threats and intimidation tactics meant nothing now. Reduced to the impotent rage of a woman who had finally discovered that Rael, consequences exist beyond her petty kingdom of mailbox regulations and lawn height requirements.